The footsteps were still behind me, crashing through the dark, and I knew if I turned around I would see those orange eyes again. So I didn't turn around. I just ran, and I prayed to a God I'd stopped believing in that the thing chasing me couldn't move as fast as it was tall. Let me go back. Let me start where it should have started, in a coffee shop on a bright Tuesday morning, when the worst thing in the world was deciding which trail to hike. Because I need you to understand that I was happy that day. I was rested. I was sober. I want that on the record before I tell you the rest, because everyone who's heard this story since has tried to take that from me, the certainty of my own senses, and I won't let them. Not anymore. His name was Marcus. We'd been roommates for 2 years back in college, the kind of friendship that survives on inside jokes and the shared trauma of group projects, and after graduation we drifted the way people do, not from any falling out, just the slow erosion of distance and busy lives. So when he texted me that he'd moved out to Shadow Falls, Massachusetts, and that I should come visit, I jumped at it. A few days away from my apartment, my job, the gray sameness of my own routine. A chance to see an old friend in a new place. Shadow Falls turned out to be one of those small New England cities that looks like a postcard had a baby with a horror movie set and never quite decided which one it wanted to be. Old brick buildings. Streets lined with maples just starting to turn. A downtown, midtown, the locals called it, full of little shops and cafes, the kind of place where the barista knows your order by your second visit. I remember thinking, as Marcus drove me in from the airport, that I could see why he liked it. It had a stillness to it. A quiet. I didn't know yet that some quiet is a warning. We met for coffee that first full morning. The plan was simple, almost embarrassingly so. Caffeine, conversation, then a hike in the mountains just outside the city limits. Marcus had been talking up the local trails for weeks, sending me photos of ridgelines and waterfalls, and I'd come prepared, boots broken in, a day pack, the whole thing. We were both experienced hikers. That mattered later. It mattered to me, anyway, even if it didn't matter to the thing in the woods. The coffee shop was warm and golden, sunlight slanting through the front windows, the espresso machine hissing and clattering behind the counter. There was the smell of roasted beans and cinnamon, of pastries under glass. A few other customers scattered through the room. Soft music. The clink of cups on saucers. We slid into a booth near the back, and Marcus pulled out his phone to show me the trail he had in mind. We talked logistics, water, time, the weather, which would be perfect, clear and cool. And somewhere in the middle of all that ordinary planning, I asked him the question that I have replayed in my mind 10,000 times since. What's it called? The trail. Redwood Forest, he said. And the moment those 2 words left his mouth, I felt the temperature of the room change. I don't mean that figuratively. I mean I felt eyes on me, the specific physical pressure of being watched, that animal sense we all carry from some older version of ourselves that knew what it meant to be prey. I looked up. An older man sat alone in the booth beside ours. He'd been there when we came in. I'd registered him the way you register furniture, a gray shape with a cup of coffee, unremarkable. But he wasn't unremarkable now. His coffee sat untouched in front of him, a thin curl of steam no longer rising from it, gone cold. And his eyes were locked on us. Not the casual glance of an eavesdropper. Not curiosity. This was focus. The flat, total attention of a man who has just heard a name he hoped never to hear again. Marcus felt it too. I watched his easy grin falter as he followed my gaze. For a few long, deeply uncomfortable seconds, none of us said anything. The barista laughed at something behind the counter. The music played. And the old man simply stared, his jaw tight, the lines of his face carved deep with something that looked, more than anything, like grief. Finally, because the silence had become unbearable, I leaned over and asked him gently if everything was all right. If there was something he needed. He leaned forward. And in a low, raspy voice, the voice of a man who has spent a long time not being believed, he said, "You can't go there." Marcus and I exchanged a glance. "Go where?" I asked, though some part of me already knew. His eyes did not blink. They were pale, watery, but underneath the cloudiness there was something terribly clear and terribly afraid. "If you go to Redwood Forest," he said, "you may never return the same again." Marcus laughed. It was a nervous laugh, the kind you make when you want to dismiss something but your body hasn't quite agreed to. "Why's that?" he asked. And the old man reached into his jacket. His hand was shaking, a deep, palsied tremor, and for one absurd second I thought he might be reaching for a weapon, and my whole body went tense. But what he pulled out was a pen. Just an ordinary ballpoint pen. He grabbed the napkin from beneath his cold coffee cup, smoothed it flat against the table, and began to draw. He drew slowly. Deliberately. The pen moved with a strange precision that didn't match the tremor in his hands, as though some muscle memory deeper than the disease in his mind had taken over. We watched in silence. And when he finished, he turned the napkin and slid it across the table toward us. It was a map. Not a real map, not topographic or to scale, but a trail map all the same, a winding line with turns and bends and little hatch marks at certain points, symbols I didn't understand, all laid out with a care that felt deliberate. Intentional. Like a thing remembered exactly because forgetting it had cost someone everything. "If you go," the old man said, "you follow this." "Exactly. If you don't," his voice dropped lower, "you won't make it back." Marcus, ever the diplomat, thanked him warmly and told him we had plenty of hiking experience, that we be careful, that we appreciated his concern. He started to push the napkin back. The old man's whole posture stiffened. "You take it," he said. "Sharp now. Loud." His voice carried across the cafe, and I saw a young employee glance over, then start toward us with the careful, placating walk of someone who has dealt with this before. I raised a hand, assured her we were fine, everything was fine. But the old man's eyes never left mine, and in that moment I felt something I still can't fully explain, a strong, almost physical instinct telling me not to walk away from that table without the napkin. So when we stood to leave, I grabbed it. I folded it once and slipped it into my back pocket before Marcus even noticed I'd taken it. The employee walked us toward the door, apologizing under her breath. She told us not to mind him. That he was a regular. That he'd been a war veteran once, and after that a park ranger out at, and here she lowered her voice, Redwood Forest, for almost 30 years. And that for the last several of those years he'd been struggling badly with dementia. Confused. Prone to outbursts. Living half in the present and half in some private past nobody else could see. I felt terrible. Of course I did. Here was a sick old man, his mind unraveling, and we treated his fear like a curiosity. I told myself that's all it was, the misfiring of a damaged brain, the same way he might forget his own address or call a stranger by his dead wife's name. A ghost of his ranger days bubbling up and attaching itself to two strangers and a name. That's what I told myself. And then we drove to Redwood Forest anyway. I have asked myself 1,000 times why we still went. The answer is shamefully simple. It was a beautiful day. We were two confident young men who had hiked 100 trails between us. And the warning had come from a source we had just been told, gently, kindly, not to take seriously. Rationality is a comfortable thing to hide inside. It's warm in there. It feels like safety. It isn't. The drive out took maybe 40 minutes, the city falling away behind us, the road narrowing and climbing until the trees crowded close on both sides. We parked the van in a small gravel lot at the trailhead. There were no other cars. A single weathered wooden sign marked the entrance, the paint peeling, the letters faded almost to nothing. And it was beautiful. I'll give it that. The trees were enormous, old oaks, mostly, despite the name, their trunks thick as cars, their canopies so high they made cathedrals of the spaces between them. The light came down in long golden shafts, full of drifting motes of pollen and dust. The air smelled of damp earth and green growing things, of bark and moss and the faint sweetness of something flowering deeper in. It was the kind of place people drive for hours to reach. The kind of place you go to feel small in a good way, to remember that the world is older and larger than your problems. We loaded our packs. Water bottles, trail mix, a first aid kit, the usual. Marcus took a photo of the sign and posted it somewhere with a caption I don't remember. And then we started down the trail. At first, everything was exactly as it should have been. The path was clear and well-worn. Birds called from the branches. A squirrel scolded us from a low limb. We talked about nothing, old friends, old times, a girl Marcus had been seeing, a job I was thinking of quitting. The ordinary music of two people comfortable in each other's company. The napkin sat folded in my back pocket, and I'd half forgotten it was there. But the farther we walked, the more the forest changed. It was gradual. So gradual that for a long time I didn't consciously notice it, the way you don't notice the sun going down until you suddenly realize you can't read anymore. The trees grew denser. The canopy thickened overhead until the long golden shafts of light became rare, isolated patches, pools of brightness scattered across a floor that was otherwise sinking into a deep green-gray gloom. The birdsong thinned. The air grew cooler, and there was a dampness to it now that hadn't been there before, a cellar cold that settled into my collar. Have you ever felt like something was watching you? That prickle at the back of your neck, the sense of a gaze you can't quite catch. Tell me in the comments, because I want to know if what I felt on that trail is the same thing you felt, or whether some of us are built to sense a thing the rest of you never will. Because I felt it then. Walking deeper into that darkening wood, I felt the eyes again. The same pressure I'd felt in the coffee shop. And there was no old man this time. There was nothing behind me but trees. It's getting dark in here, Marcus said, and I heard the same unease in his voice that was crawling up my own spine. He tried to laugh it off. Spooky. Yeah, I said. I didn't laugh. We kept walking. The patches of sunlight ahead were our breadcrumbs now, the only reliable way to see more than a few feet of the path. Between them, the darkness was thick and almost liquid, and I found myself hurrying through the dim stretches to reach the light, then pausing in each pool of sun like a swimmer coming up for air. And then, in one of those pools of light, we saw the backpack. It lay in the middle of the trail, perhaps 20 feet ahead. Torn open. Not unzipped, torn, the fabric split and frayed, the contents flung across the path and into the underbrush as though someone had grabbed it and shaken it empty in a rage, or as though it had been ripped apart from the inside. A phone, screen cracked, lying face up in the dirt. A wallet. Clothes, a shirt, a single shoe, scattered like the aftermath of something I didn't want to imagine. We stopped. "Hello?" Marcus called out. His voice didn't carry the way it should have. It seemed to fall flat against the trees, swallowed. "Anybody out here?" Nothing answered. I crouched and picked up the wallet. I don't fully know why. Some instinct, I suppose, the same one that had made me take the napkin, the sense that I might need it, that someone might need it. There was a driver's license inside. A young man's face, smiling. A name. I told myself we'd find whoever it belonged to further down the trail. That he was somewhere up ahead, embarrassed, having lost his pack to a curious bear. I put the wallet in my pocket next to the napkin. I needed there to be an explanation. I needed it the way you need air. If you're still listening to this, if this story is the reason you're not asleep yet, do me a favor and subscribe. We post new horror here every single night, and I promise you the things I have left to tell are worse than what I've told so far. I only wish, on that trail, that someone had been there to warn me the same way I'm warning you. Though I suppose someone had. I just hadn't listened. We took a few more steps. And the next pool of sunlight showed us something pale lying across the dirt ahead, half buried in fallen leaves. I didn't understand it at first. My brain refused to assemble the shape into anything that made sense. It was the color of it that was wrong, that grayish, waxy pale, and the way it lay, too still, too heavy. We got closer. And then the shape resolved itself, and I felt the world tilt under me. It was a leg. A human leg. Severed at the thigh. Not cut, the edges were torn, uneven, ragged in a way that no blade makes, the way meat tears when it is pulled apart by something stronger than the body it belongs to. The skin had gone gray. It was crusted with dried mud and darkened blood, and there were leaves stuck to it, and I will spare you the rest of what I saw because I have spent years trying to unsee it and I will not paint it for you in the detail it lives in for me. I screamed. I didn't decide to. It tore out of me, louder than I knew I could be, a sound that scattered out into the trees and came back wrong, deadened. Marcus stumbled backward, yanking out his phone, holding it up, turning in a slow circle searching for a signal that wasn't there, his face gone white, his mouth moving without words. And that's when the forest behind him went silent. I mean truly silent. Not the soft hush of a quiet wood, but an absolute, pressing absence of sound. No wind. No insects. No birds. The dampness in the air seemed to thicken into something you could feel against your skin, a stillness with weight to it. It was the silence of a held breath. The silence of a room when someone is standing just behind you. Then the trees began to move. Not in the wind, there was no wind. They moved as though they were being pushed apart from the far side, the trunks groaning, leaning, the deep wet crack of living wood splitting under enormous force. Something was coming through them. Something large enough to part 100-year-old oaks like tall grass. I opened my mouth to warn Marcus. I tried to make a sound, any sound, to scream his name, to tell him to run. But before the word could form in my throat, a shape came out of the darkness between the trees. It was enormous. That's the word my mind keeps reaching for, and it is never enough. It rose up out of the gloom taller than the oaks themselves, a mountain of muscle and matted fur, and the fur was dark, soaked and clotted with a red so deep it looked almost black in the dimness, too dark, too thick, to be anything but what I feared it was. And set in that vast and shadowed face were two eyes. Bright orange. Burning. Fixed. On us. I have tried, in the years since, to find words for those eyes. I have failed every time. They were not the eyes of an animal. An animal's eyes are empty, beautiful, indifferent. These eyes had something behind them. They were aware. They saw us, and they understood what we were, and they did not care, and that not caring was the most terrifying thing I have ever felt directed at me. It moved before either of us could. It crossed the distance between the trees and Marcus. In a single motion that my mind couldn't follow, and it closed one massive hand around him and lifted him off the ground as though he weighed nothing at all, as though he were a doll, a leaf, a thing of no consequence. And then it threw him. It threw my friend deep into the black between the trees, and he vanished into the dark, and I want you to know that I did not hear his scream until I was already running. I ran. I have never run like that in my life, and I pray I never have to again. I couldn't feel the ground. I couldn't feel my legs. There was only the trail unspooling in front of me in the failing light and the sound behind me, the heavy, earth-shaking crash of footsteps, each one a thud I felt in my chest before I heard it, the whole forest shuddering with the weight of the thing pursuing me. I couldn't see. The dark stretches between the sunlight had become a blur, branches whipping my face, roots catching my feet. I knew, somewhere underneath the animal terror, some small cold rational part of me knew, that I could not outrun it. It was too large. Its stride was too long. If I stayed on the trail, it would have me. So I did the only thing I could think of. I threw myself off the path, to the right, into a wall of thick brush, and I crashed through it and dropped down into the dark and went still. And the footsteps stopped. I lay there in the brush, shaking so hard I could hear my own teeth, tears streaming down my face, my hand pressed over my own mouth to keep myself from making a sound. I was too afraid to breathe. The silence had come back, that same total, pressing, listening silence, and I understood that it was listening. That it was out there, somewhere very close, holding still exactly as I was holding still, waiting for me to give myself away. I don't know how long I lay there. Minutes. It felt like hours. And in the middle of that frozen, endless terror, a thought surfaced through the panic like something rising from deep water. The napkin. The old man's map. With hands that would barely obey me, I reached back and drew it out of my pocket and unfolded it against the leaves, and in a thin stray finger of the last daylight I looked at it, really looked at it, for the first time. And my blood turned to ice. We had been going the wrong way. The trail we'd followed from the lot, the obvious trail, the well-worn one, the one the wooden sign had pointed us down, was the exact opposite of the path drawn on that napkin. Every turn we should have taken, we'd ignored. Every bend the old man had marked, we'd passed by. He hadn't been mapping the way in. He'd been mapping the way the forest doesn't want you to go. The way back. The way out. So I made a decision that I still can't believe I had the nerve to make. I crept out of the brush, slow, so slow, every movement a separate act of will, and I found the trail again, and I started to follow the napkin. Not the way we'd come. The other way. Through the turns the old man's shaking hand had drawn. Left where everything in me wanted to go right. Deeper, at first, into the dark, before the path began, impossibly, to climb back toward the light. And it worked. I don't know how. I don't know what the map was, or what it knew, or how a dementia-ridden old man had carried its every turn in his ruined memory for years against the day two strangers would say the wrong name in a coffee shop. But I followed it, turn by turn, and the trees began to thin, and the light began to grow, and the dampness lifted from the air, and the silence gave way, finally, blessedly, to the sound of wind in the high branches. I broke out of the tree lane into open daylight, and the gravel lot was right there in front of me, and our van, and the ordinary impossible blue of the afternoon sky. I have never been so glad to see asphalt and gravel and a battered old van in my entire life. I ran to it, fumbled the door open, threw myself inside, locked it, and sat there shaking, gasping, alive. Then I drove. I don't remember most of the drive. I remember the trees flashing past and my hands white-knuckled on the wheel and the way I kept checking the mirrors, certain I'd see something massive coming through the tree lane behind me. I drove straight to the Shadow Falls Police Department and stumbled in through the doors still covered in dirt and scratches and dried tears, and I told them everything. I told them about the trail. About the backpack. About the leg. About the thing in the woods and about Marcus, about how it had taken him, thrown him, how I'd left him out there because there was nothing on this earth, that I could have done. And I put the wallet on the counter in front of them. They went quiet when they saw the wallet. They took the name off the license and ran it, and a few minutes later an officer came back with a strange, careful look on his face and told me that the man whose wallet I'd found had been reported missing 3 days earlier. He'd gone hiking. In Redwood Forest. And he had never come back. For one moment, I felt something like relief. They believed me. They had to believe me now. Here was proof, a real missing person, a real wallet I couldn't possibly have had any other way. They told me they would send a team out to the trail to investigate. They never did. I called. I called the next day, and the day after, and the week after that. The answers got vaguer each time. The team was being scheduled. The team was delayed. There were jurisdiction issues. The trail was being assessed. And then, slowly, the tone changed, and I understood that no one was going into Redwood Forest, that no one had ever had any intention of going into Redwood Forest, and that the conversation had quietly shifted from what happened out there to what was wrong with me. They were gentle about it. That was almost the worst part. They suggested that Marcus had simply gotten lost, that it happens, that the woods are big and disorienting and people wander off the trail all the time. They suggested that what I'd seen, the leg, the creature, might not have been real. That the mind does strange things under extreme stress. That trauma can manufacture monsters to explain a loss too large to face. They used soft words. Dissociation. Acute stress. They asked, kindly, whether I'd been drinking. Whether I'd taken anything. I hadn't. I want to say that again, as plainly as I can, because I have had to say it so many times that the words have worn smooth in my mouth. I had not been drinking. I had not taken any drug. My mind was clear and rested and whole that morning, and it was clear when the trees split apart, and it is clear now. I know what I saw. What would you have done? If you'd been the one to stumble out of those trees into the sunlight, would you have kept fighting to make them believe you, or would you have let them give you the comfortable lie? I still wonder, to this day, whether I should have just stopped talking. Whether the people who survive these things are simply the ones who learn to stay quiet. Because the more I insisted, the more alone I became. Marcus was never found. There was a search, of a kind, a few volunteers, a day of calling his name along the first half-mile of the trail, the safe half, the part before the light starts to die. They found nothing. No backpack. No wallet but the one I'd brought out. No leg. The forest had closed over all of it the way still water closes over a dropped stone. Officially, he is a missing person. Lost while hiking. Presumed, eventually, dead. His family grieves a man who wandered off a trail. I am the only one who knows that the trail wandered off from him. A week after it happened, before I left Shadow Falls, before I drove home and tried and failed to return to a life that no longer fit me, I went back to the coffee shop. I don't fully know what I was looking for. Answers, maybe. Or just the one other person on earth who might not look at me like I was broken. And he was there. The old man. Sitting in the same booth, a fresh cup of coffee cooling untouched in front of him, his hands folded, his pale eyes fixed on the middle distance as though he were watching something none of the rest of us could see. I sat down across from him. I opened my mouth to speak, to thank him, to ask him, to beg him to tell me what the thing in the woods was and how he knew and what I was supposed to do now with the rest of my ruined life. But before I could make a sound, he spoke. Quietly. Not to me, quite. To the room, or to the memory, or to the thing itself. And his voice, for those few seconds, was not the voice of a confused old man at all. It was steady. Certain. The voice of a ranger who had spent 30 years standing guard at the edge of something he could never quite keep people away from. The beast that stalks the forest of red, he said, eats and feasts on the living and dead. Stay alert. Stay quiet. Or you will fall to the red giant. Then his eyes cleared, and clouded, and he looked at me as though he had never seen me before in his life, and asked me if I was the young man who brought his order. And whatever had spoken through him was gone. I left Shadow Falls that afternoon. I have never gone back, and I never will. I still have the napkin. I keep it in a drawer I rarely open, folded along the same creases the old man pressed into it with his shaking hands, and on the nights when I'm sure I've finally started to forget, the orange eyes, the wet crack of the trees, the weightless way it lifted my friend into the dark, I take it out and unfold it, and I look at all those careful turns leading away from the place where the light dies, and I remember. I think about the leg sometimes. About the wallet of a man missing 3 days. About how the forest swallowed every trace and the people whose job it is to look simply chose not to. And I think the old man understood something the rest of them refused to. That some places are not lost. They are kept. That the red giant has been feasting in that forest of red for longer than any of us has been alive, and that the only protection any of us ever had was the trembling memory of one dying man, drawing the way out on a coffee-stained napkin, hoping someone would be afraid enough to listen. I wasn't. Marcus paid for that. So when someone tells you not to go somewhere, when a stranger with frightened eyes presses a warning into your hand and asks for nothing in return except that you take it seriously, take it seriously. Take the napkin. Stay alert. Stay quiet. Or you will fall to the red giant. Subscribe for more horror every single night. And if you want more stories that will keep you up, check out What the Wow Stories for the wildest relationship drama you've ever heard. Link below. Sleep well.